Overall, our growth outturn of 3.4%, an impressive 4.8% in Q1 and Q2 of 2022 respectively, coupled with modest improvements in our fiscal position, suggests our economy is gradually on the upswing despite the numerous shocks we have faced over the past 2 years. These figures demonstrate that in spite of recent challenges, there has been economic growth, modest as the gains so far may be. This progress gives us a solid foundation to confront the challenges ahead. Undoubtedly, global risks remain on the horizon, including a strengthening US dollar and higher interest rates, which negatively affect external borrowing. This development is exerting enormous pressure on our balance of payment position, and thus the need for us to expedite engagement with the IMF. Within this context, government is finalizing its post-COVID-19 economic program as a domestic blueprint to engage the IMF. This document has already benefited from input from key stakeholders, including civil society, social partners, labor, employers, and faith-based organizations, academia, industry professionals, and the leadership of Parliament. Additional stakeholder engagements will be held to solicit further inputs for the program. Having a sustainable debt path is a prerequisite for the IMF program. Therefore, the IMF, World Bank, and the Ghana team are currently undertaking a debt sustainability analysis to inform the program negotiations. In addition, the IMF and government team are working to update the medium-term macro-fiscal framework to inform IMF program design. Also, the government team and the IMF team are discussing policy measures and structural reforms proposed in an economic program aimed at addressing the economic challenges facing the country towards restoring and sustaining macroeconomic stability, fiscal and debt sustainability, as well as promoting durable and inclusive growth and social protection. We simply have not reached any agreement with the fund on the parameters of any debt operation as we are in the process of completing the debt sustainability analysis. Government shall continue to actively engage all stakeholders in a clear and transparent manner as we seek to fast-track the IMF negotiation process. Ghana needs a viable domestic financial system to support its development program, especially in these 3 years with limited access to international capital markets. Therefore, everything must and will be done to protect our financial sector, and there must be room for a win-win conversation through extensive stakeholder engagement with both our domestic and external investors. Ghana has always had a collaborative approach with its partners, and we shall, I'm confident, come out of an historic arrangement. This is a government that protected the savings of 4.6 million Ghanaian depositors with the reform of the banking and financial sector. Even in our early days, we owe it to the economy and Ghanaians to keep protecting it. The sanctity and the well-functioning of the financial system is sacrosanct, and we need the support and trust of all Ghanaians to deliver this. Let us join hands to get this done. The great Celtic miracle in Ireland in the 80s was a result of such collaboration, especially with Labour, and we shall also be blessed with the Ghana miracle.
The war in Ukraine has triggered a global economic shock that's hitting Ghana and, as I said, many other countries, and all at a time when, for many of these countries, their room for fiscal maneuver, if I could put it that way, is already extremely limited because they've used a lot of fiscal power already, firepower already in the pandemic.
Well, so that's Ghana's Finance Minister, Ken Ofori-Atta, just this week giving us updates on our economic situation, also on the talks with IMF. And then you also heard Gary Rice there briefly there speaking. He speaks for the IMF in that Zoom encounter. So I'd like us to have a discussion on this where we break it down to the barest minimum for the ordinary person to understand where it is that we are currently when it comes to our economy and our talks with the IMF whilst we seek that $3 billion deal. Mr. Ewa, I know that there were some 7 pillars that were put out by the finance minister. We'll go through them, but the 4th pillar is building strong financial institutions, for which reason I'll start with you on this. And for many who have bonds, they are investors. We have external and domestic, investors. We know that no agreement has been reached in the area of the debt operation parameters as put out by the finance minister. But really, paint a picture to us about what our financial institutions look like as we speak. We've seen that report by APSA and what they are projecting in terms of how much the cedi to the dollar will be looking like at the end of the year. They say about 12 cedis amongst others. People have their investments in your institutions. Right now, listening to you, they want to have an understanding of what happens to these, investments they have. So paint that picture to us. Be frank with us and let us know what exactly the situation is.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emefa. The minister couldn't have put it any better that during these periods such as this, we need stronger, resilient, and banks that have the capacity to engineer the growth that we are looking for. It is the time that when banks are even making huge profits, we should be excited about, because this is the time for banks to build capital buffers. As economic turbulence happens, sometimes the risk factors don't crystallize immediately. They are always in the horizon, and banks should be able to prepare for that eventuality and have the capital levels and the necessary balance sheet to be able to accommodate the shocks when they do occur. And I say when, not if. Because the economic distress that we are witnessing now is at the household level, at the business level, and at the country level. At all 3 levels, the banks are impacted. The banks have funded the individuals and households. The banks have funded businesses. And the banks have, as you said, funded the government in the area of our exposure to government securities. So everything must be done to ensure that we have stronger banks that can accommodate any potential distress from businesses and any potential distress from households, and in our case now, in our discussion now, any potential distress from the state or the distress from the states that we are dealing with at the moment. To paint a picture, I would say that banks are strong. We have the right liquidity levels at the moment. The capital levels are within regulatory limits. But I would also say that the environment has not been good for banking. We've had over 35% depreciation of the currency. When that happens, there is a stress on bank capital because we have foreign currency component of our balance sheet, and we report in the local currency, and that immediately transfer or translate into a stress on capital levels. We've also witnessed an environment of such accelerated pace in growth of interest rates. And when it happens and you are a bank, you are exposed to interest rates or instruments that were issued at the time when interest rates were in the regions of late teens and early 20s. And all of a sudden, we are talking about interest rates in the region of upper 30s. Immediately, as a bank, you have a challenge of mark-to-market losses. And once you record mark-to-market losses, the direct impact is not on your profitability, but on your capital. And capital is the live wire. It's capital and liquidity. If you lose it, you don't have a bank. So we have to do everything to protect the capital of the industry. We have to do everything to ensure that the industry is liquid. You would also recall that not too long ago, the central bank came out with some emergency measures. And one of the measures was an increase in the cash reserve requirement of banks. So already banks have that extra layer of distress in terms of additional liquidity that is being squeezed out of the banking system in an attempt to arrest inflation. So we need to do everything, as I said earlier, to ensure, and here I'm quoting the minister, that we have a stronger and better financial system, both during and after these IMF discussions.
Well, there are key questions that we'll be raising, because there are questions I've seen about if we have a bond, for instance, in these financial institutions, should we be expecting a call from government, for instance, during this whole process? Because we are doing the debt sustainability analysis so far. We've seen the rankings and the World Bank website, the risk of external debt distress and risk of overall debt distress. These are high, very high. And we've seen some debt sustainability analysis done by Imani. We've seen that of the NDC also mentioned that what it looks like is just not good on paper. And we are yet to experience it, and people have started experiencing it or talking about it already. But Dr. Twumasi, you've been listening to the finance minister put out these 7 pillars, where we are in terms of these talks and the outcome of it, and hoping that we'll have some sort of a deal that will be reflecting in the budget that will be announced or put out in November. Tell us really where we stand in all this. I'm sure you've been following these whole talks with the IMF amongst others. Tell us where we stand. You'd have to unmute. Super.
Yes, thank you, Emefa. I believe that, like the finance minister indicated, it is evident based on the macroeconomic indicators that all is not well in Ghana. And for that matter, they have sought for assistance from the IMF. But for me, I do not want to send us all the way back, but to put the discussion in context. When you look at our historical path in terms of our journey with IMF, Ghana as a country, you see that the indicators that always make us go in for a fund-assisted programs have not changed. Currently, we are looking at unsustainable debt levels. We are looking at a currency that is depreciating. That is also putting a lot of pressure on our balance of payments. So that means that our ability to import essential commodities like petroleum, pharmaceutical products, and items that are not produced in Ghana, we are consistently in a tight situation. And for that matter, they have had to approach the fund for assistance. But how did we get here? You see that when you look at the debt composition of Ghana currently, we have a blend of domestic and foreign debts. And when you look at historical antecedents as well, prior to HIPIC, the very famous HIPIC in 2001, we saw that at the time, our debt levels were also quite unsustainable, 145% in terms of debt to GDP ratio. So we had to go for HIPIC. And this was at the time where Ghana was a lower income country, right? So we qualify for debt forgiveness because most of our debts were concessionary loans, where our debts were with bilateral agencies. So you could be forgiven in terms of your debts. So after HIPIC, you see that when you come down all the way to 2006, for example, our debt to GDP was around 26%, which was a very good place for the country. And then you come all the way, we rebase, and then we came to, in 2018, debt to GDP was at 57%. Why do we make a lot of emphasis with debt to GDP ratio? It's looking at prospective investors want to look at the potential for the government to be able to pay back its loan. And so your ability to generate wealth is an indicator that you can pay back. And that is why the debt to GDP ratio is critical. So when you look at this, you see that we attained a lower middle income status in 2011, thereabout, on the back of oil discovery. And you see that now the country no longer qualified for most of the bilateral loans and concessional loans and grants as well. So the avenue was to go onto the international markets for us to borrow, because now we have the muscle to be able to do that and explore. And we've done that over time consistently, and you've seen that the market has responded positively. The downside with opening yourself as a country on the international market is that you become also quite volatile. because your country is an investment avenue for both domestic and foreign investors. So there is always speculative activities that are going on. People are keenly watching your macroeconomic fundamentals to be able to take a decision whether they want to invest or not. And that is where rating agencies in recent times have become quite critical in the discussions, because they are looking at the indicators to make a projection to prospective investors. And certainly, when you look at the consistent bad ratings that Ghana has received based on the back of rising inflation, depreciation, and the accumulation of the debts, it is a situation that Ghana has been cut out of the international markets. And with the rising inflation, you also see that the central bank is rightfully also increasing the prime rate to tighten the space and reduce the rate of inflation in the economy. With the central bank doing that, you also see that it leads to increases in interest rates, and that increases the cost of borrowing of governments. So on one hand, we've been shut out of the international financial market. And then on the domestic market as well, government has had to borrow at a very high rate. So you see that there is not much room for government to maneuver than to go and seek for policy credibility, which was also one of the reasons why we approached the IMF in 2015 as well. So I am giving all these historical antecedents for us to know that, yes, indeed, the structure of the economy is not changing. The fundamentals consistently remain the same, but it appears that we seem to consistently hope for the better. Rightfully, we should, but I believe that policymakers ought to get to work as we enter into this program and also moving forward, so that indeed, this is our 17th time, we don't find ourselves in the situation we find ourselves in right now. And currently, what is making it even more dire is the fact that the government has to restructure the debt, and given that domestic debt constitutes the largest chunk of government debt, it is rightfully so that government needs to look at the domestic markets in terms of restructuring. Which people are the holders of government debts on the domestic market? The financial sector, and then households. So for me, the issue is that whatever it is, there would be some people would lose. Let me put it that way. But I also like the
some
fact
people
that
will lose. Which people would this be? Is the key question. And lose exactly. What exactly would they lose?
Okay, so in terms of debt restructuring, the laws could come in the form of government negotiating with debt owners that they would have to probably cut down on some of the interest rates. I'm sure you've heard discussions about haircuts, for example, that is receiving less than the market value of any assets that you own, right? But for me, also looking at the history of the country, the restructuring should be done in such a way that households are insulated from the adverse possible effects that would happen. And given that the finance minister has also committed to a robust financial sector, we are quite keen to come out with the innovative ways in which government would want to restructure the domestic debt. It possibly could come with a negotiation in terms of extension of maturities, which is also something that is done. So if your bonds or your treasury bills are due next month, government could renegotiate with you to pay in 2 months, right? And possibly not pay the going interest rates at the time. All these are avenues that exist. But as we go through all these, we need to be careful that households' incomes are protected, particularly given that Ghana, we struggle with a lot of Ponzi schemes in the financial sector. If people people have confidence in government and they have invested in government, I believe that the responsibility is on government to protect their savings. And for that matter, I'm quite passionate about the households component, the individuals, in terms of who are the owners of the debt in the domestic, what do we call it?
Well, but that said, I'll come to you, Mr. Jinapo, but briefly, let me clear this with Mr. Ewa on this, with that picture that has been painted in terms of our financial institutions, amongst others, and these haircuts. I don't know how low the haircuts will be, but the concern is, with all that we know so far, and some of the banks that we've heard, at least we've seen their projections, amongst others, and the concerns that has been raised, amidst this debt restructuring, finance institutions, at least banks, we're told, may be the largest hit in all this. And you say that you're hopeful that our banking sector will remain strong, will not see collapses like we saw in the past. Is that what you say? You're hopeful?
I'm very hopeful, and that is why I would like to take the minister's word for what it is, that in whatever arrangements.
Yes, we've heard the minister's words, but you are there on the ground, okay? You are there on the ground. You lead these bank associations, like you lead these bankers or these banks, so to speak. What really is the situation such that after these debt restructuring, we'll have our banks intact as a country? Is that what you say?
Yes, and I agree with you on the point that you have just raised. And when people talk about protection of households, I agree 100%. We must also know that it's the same households who own or whose deposits the bank has given or the banks have given to the state. Mm-hmm. So if you save the banks, you are saving households. So we cannot take one and isolate it from the other. The banks, apart from the capital levels, if you pick any of the banks, the bank with the largest capital level in this country maybe is just a little about 1 billion Ghana cedis. But they have huge investment in excess of 80 billion Ghana cedis with the state. Whose money is that? It's depositors. And who are the depositors? It's households, individuals, businesses. Mm-hmm. So anything that goes to also frustrate the balance sheet of the banks and the capital levels of the bank in a manner that results in a banking system that is not resilient and is not strong enough to absorb any shocks should also be avoided. And that is why the minister said what he said. He is an investment banker. He understands these things. So I don't want to jump the gun because we all know, they said in the discussions, they have not got into debt operations. They have not got into the level where we are talking about haircut. And these days, I don't even want to turn on the radio because people are talking about haircut as though where you go to the salon to just have. It is huge. It is big. And let's not just use it loosely. It is, it's like somebody owing you and saying, I can't pay your money, but you come for your money. I gave you 10 cedis, now I'll give you 5. It is that big. And we need to be very careful how we contextualize this discussion.
Will that not be the reality at some point that we should brace ourselves for?
Of course, and I like what my fellow panelists say about various forms of restructuring is available. We have a debt extension, maturities are in the horizon or coming up. You can have a situation where you have extensions to this, but those are soft levels of restructuring. Yes, they have liquidity implications because banks plan their liquidity. They know that maturities are coming, and they have liabilities that those maturities perhaps are going to sell or service. So if maturities are unduly extended, it could also have impact on liquidity. And we believe that when we come to that, the central bank can then perhaps create a window for the banking system and say, if you have been asked to do an extension of your maturities so that we are able to reach debt sustainability, if as a result of that you have liquidity needs, we from Bank of Ghana will step in to support the bank requirement. I think that is perhaps an avenue that we should explore more and perhaps come less on these discussions around shaving off from the portfolio.
But in all this, though, curious, what's the role of the Bankers Association in all this?
We are playing a very critical role. The bank, the central bank or the Minister of Finance will not be engaging individual banks. So we have a community of banks, and that community of banks is headed by the association, which I happen to head. So we are really at the forefront of any discussions with the banking industry. We need to be able to bring individual bank situations to the table. There are decisions that can be taken that Bank A can accommodate, but Bank C or D or F will struggle to even take 50% of it. We need to understand the dynamics of the industry, and that is where we come in to provide that kind of understanding of the industry dynamics, where banks are from the tier 1 to the tier 3s, where each of them are, so we can properly situate the discussions and take decisions that are optimal for the banks and for the country. We have to reach, as the minister said, a win-win situation. And reaching that win-win situation is understanding, we understand why we are where we are and the discussion from that side. There's not much to understand from that side. But there is that end of the banking industry, the pension funds, the asset managers, the household holders, the offshore holders. We have the insurers who also put insured money or premiums into government bonds. So if you go and do a haircut, it's going to affect their ability to pay claims. So these dynamics all come to the fore so that we can have a more forward-looking discussion that seeks to protect the interest of all participants and not maybe solve one problem and create a lot more problems for the industry. And I talk about the banking industry because of what and where we are coming from. Okay. We just come from a market where confidence went to all-time low, where banks went under, banks were consolidated. And we do not want a situation where after any program of a sort, we are going to have to deal with that situation where we have to be building back confidence in the banking system. And I believe that the managers of the economy have these backgrounds to their discussions and they understand it. And from the initial conversations that we've had, I'm quite confident that the understanding is there. And we need to just come to a decision point of how we deal with it. But let's not forget, it's not just about debt. It's also about expenditure. It's also about revenue of the government. So debt sustainability is not just a debt. I mean, but why do you have the debt? Because you are borrowed to spend. So you need to look at what do we spend our money on? What can we do? What else? I know that we've cut discretionary spend by 30%. What else can be cut? On the revenue side, we know that there are leakages. I just heard of a news article on Joy of customs, leaking the state about 300 million, I don't know whether it's dollar or CD, annually because of just oil imports from the sub-region. If we have pockets of this in the system, to what extent are we going to have all coming to the table? We close out these loopholes so the kitty becomes bigger, the expenditure side goes down, and then we begin talking about what else, whether we have to even touch the debt. And that is being held by the banking system.
I was hoping you let us in, actually, on what exactly you've been told that gives you that kind of confidence in what has been said. But I'll come to you again on this, and also Dr. Twumasi on this. But let me come to the studio now and bring in Mr. Jinapor on this particular IMF situation. He's also on the Finance Committee of Parliament, and we've been told there's an extensive engagement the Finance Minister mentions as he puts out the 7 pillars. And tells us that before he comes to you in Parliament in November to present the budget for 2023, hopefully some form of a deal would have been agreed on with the IMF such that it will reflect in the budget.
First of all, I've heard a lot of these things from the Finance Minister, from the Chairman or Head of the Economic Management Team, several assurances, but we keep deteriorating. And so, rather than talking too much, I think they should focus on the job. We've had several assurances. Quite recently, the Finance Minister held a press conference and gave us these same itemized issues and gave us so much assurance, it turned out to be negative. The Vice President himself has done that, it turned out to be negative. And so it's not enough just talking. And I'm happy that the Bankers Association says that they appreciate the cause of the problem. What I see is that the current managers of the economy do not appreciate the cause of the problem. And until you appreciate the cause of the problem, it's very, very difficult to prescribe some solutions to that problem. Because when you hear the excuses they are given, it just makes you feel that, look, this economy is in the wrong hands. It's true, we met the finance minister, and I was one of the people who were chosen. We're quite few from Parliament. We met the finance minister in Koforidua, and I can tell you that this economy is really sick. It's worse than they even try to tell us.
But that's good news. At least there's some engagement with your position. For instance, government is not just dealing with this by itself.
So let me deal with the issues.
Okay.
Now, if you look at the Ministry of Finance's own report on the fiscal side, our total revenue for the first 2 quarters was 37 billion. That's total revenue, all the revenues accruing to the state. And normally when you are looking at this, your emphasis is on the tax revenue. Tax revenue was 30 billion. Meanwhile, when you take 2 items, compensation and debt servicing, is 42 billion. So the total revenue is not even enough to meet just 2 line items. That is debt servicing, which is interest and amortization, and then compensation. Before you then come to look at GET Fund, NHIS, District Assembly Common, all the other statutory payments, when you put all together, it's about 60 billion. So 37 billion against 60 billion tells you the difference in terms of the amount of money we need to even reach par. Bearing in mind that there's no opportunity for you to go to the Eurobond. So it's a serious matter. And our information is that because they are not getting the revenues, the Bank of Ghana is hard to support. And so by the end of the year, all this liquidity support the Bank of Ghana is giving would crystallize. And the state would have to absorb that or make provision for that as part of our national debt. Other than that, the Bank of Ghana would have to make provision for that in their balance sheet, which will also knock them off. So this is a really, really serious problem. And in Koforidua, we gave a lot of advice to the minister. Inflation is now at about 34%. I mean, who can survive such a condition where inflation is about 34%? And the bankers themselves tells you the cost of borrowing now is gone through the roofs. The currency is depreciating at an alarming rate. And so clearly, things are very, very, very difficult. The question is, what do you do going forward? We'll be meeting the IMF, the Finance Committee, I think on the 5th of this month. And so far, we have indication that the IMF is now coming to agree with some of the things we talked about. For instance, the Sino-Hydro facility is almost due for payment. We don't have any bauxite processed into alumina. We don't have any aluminium. And in this sector, you need minimum 3 years to put up a factory. I mean, we are nowhere near that factory. So this will crystallize. It's about 6 billion. Energy sector debt of about 10 billion. It's obvious that I've checked from the logbox. They don't have any significant money to pay the principal when it's due. And it's due, I think, in 2024. So we have to make provision for that. That's about 10 billion. Cocoa Board, they have a debt of 14 billion. They cannot service it.
As a cocoa bills.
They have to make provision for that. GET Fund, 2.5 billion. When you put all that together, that's about 32 billion, which is very likely to hit the public debt. If you take what Bank of Ghana is doing, and then all these bills I'm talking about, when you put them on the national debt, it takes us to more than 100% GDP versus our debt. The debt would go beyond the GDP by about 100%. So there's no doubt that we will restructure your debt. I can understand. The Bankers Association, they are very worried. And I heard Madam say that, look, there'll be some level of restructuring. Because the money is not there. And some of these debts are maturing. And even when you take our domestic debt, a chunk of it is owned by foreigners. You see, in the US, they use nationality because they deal with dollar. We use currency. If it's CD, we say that is domestic. If it's not CD, we say it's foreign. But we allow foreigners to bring their dollars to convert it to CD-denominated bonds in Ghana. So we took 2.5 billion from Franklin Templeton, converted it to CD bonds, and our currency stabilized. So the stability we're realizing was because we always go to borrow money artificially to put it in the economy, and then you are seeing some level of stability. But now that the international market is closed, those dollars are not flowing in again. So you see your CD depreciating at an alarming rate. So even those with domestic bonds, when you pay them the coupon or interest, they go to the Bank of Ghana and say, look, I want dollars because I want to repatriate the money. So clearly, we are in difficult moments, and debt restructuring is inevitable. The question we should be answering is, how do you restructure the debt? How do you deal with the domestic component?
Were you given that indication when you met the finance
minister? We were
minister?
clear that we think that it would be suicidal to focus only on the domestic side. Well, what these banks do, principally, aside other things they do, is to mobilize excess liquidity by pooling deposits together and then advancing them to a deficit unit in the form of credit. And so a lot of the monies you see sitting in their balance sheets are from depositors, like myself and you. So I give, say, 10,000 CD to my bank, expecting that maybe in 6 months, I'll get, say, some 10% on it. So if government decides that the banks should take a haircut, either you extend the maturity period, reduce the principal, reduce the interest, extend the interest, but any way you look at it, it means that the banks will have to take a hit. And if you look at the debt or credit portfolio, the banks have a substantial amount of money with government. The banks cannot do anything than to tell their depositors or customers that, look, I'm taking a hit here, so you must also take a hit. If you reduce my deposit in the bank, you know what is going to happen? I say, fine. If my 10,000, I can't even get my 10,000, it's 9,000, give my money to me. None of these banks can withstand a run. If there's a run on the banks, most of them would fold up. So for me, I think that the Ministry of Finance should be engaging all these stakeholders on how to deal with the debt in terms of the restructuring. Because the restructuring is inevitable. Is this same passing the buck and pretending that all is well that has brought us in this mess? So let's agree that there are real difficulties. We may not be able to service the debt the way it ought to be, and that something ought to be done. But we told the minister that the minister is so fixated on the revenue side. So in the ensuing budget that we're going to witness, I can predict that there will be some taxes. Look, there's going to be very difficult moments for us because he needs to mobilize that revenue to address the expenditure situation. How is he going to do that?
More taxes? Up to how many of them?
So how is he going to raise that revenue if you don't restructure the debt? And the debt component is a huge amount. I think it's about 35 or about 30 billion. I'll check it, both interest and amortization. And it's due. You have to be paying it. What do? You have to raise the money somewhere to pay or to tell the debt holder that, look, I cannot pay you now. I mean, there's no other way. I owe you, say, 50,000. I have to pay you by end of October. My salary is just 10,000. There's a 40,000 deficit. What do I do? Meanwhile, I cannot borrow. Because look at the rates now. And the more you increase the rates, the more the interest component, which makes your debt servicing more expensive. So what can the minister do given the circumstance? And this issue about IMF, look, the IMF is not Father Christmas. That's why the IMF is engaging. I know they've made GMPC, they've made all the energy sector SOEs, they are meeting us. They want to have a true picture of Ghana's debt situation first.
If you don't have the second meeting that the committee is going to have with the IMF team, at least we know that they had some pre-engagement with you in the second meeting. What would you say as you sit here? You're a ranking member. You're going into that meeting with what exactly, you'd say?
I'm clear in my mind that we'll remind the IMF that we raised these issues with you Debt that is the nation debt or national debt, but the Minister of Finance has decided that he won't treat it as such. So you have something like energy sector levies debt.
Yeah.
The debt in the energy sector, he's formed what he calls ESLA PLC, a special purpose vehicle, with no money, it has no balance sheet. And put the debt on ESLA PLC. How does ESLA PLC pay for the debt? From the revenue section of the budget. Because when you look at the budget, it's basically the revenue section and the expenditure section. The revenue section, you see ESLA receivables. He's supposed to pay for that debt, but he decides that it's not our debt. Get fund. He goes to borrow money in the name of Get Fund and decides that it's not our national debt. So that is the key issue we are going to raise with the IMF. That we are in this mess because we don't even have a true picture of our national debt. And that is imperative that we have a true picture of the national debt so that all of us can prepare. Sino-Hydro, they told us it's barter trade. And then we're not going to pay with our money. We'll process bauxite into alumina. It's time to be a fiasco. And the Vice President was championing this. We cautioned them. So sometimes when we speak, it's not as if we are naysayers. I mean, knowledge does not reside in one person's head. Today, the chicken have come home to roost. And we have to make provision for all these issues. So we have told the minister that look at the expenditure side as well.
But it's mentioned that there have been cuts. No new vehicles are being bought. We are told about unnecessary travels, at least in the last, just that we were not giving details as in how much exactly we've been able to make or keep out of that expenditure cut. But we are told there are expenditure.
We ask for details. We've been seeing them traveling up and down.
And it's necessary, they say.
Which one is not necessary? So tell us the travels that were not necessary that you cut. So does that mean government was already engaging in travels that were not necessary? Is that what they are telling us? That now all of a sudden they've realized that, look, some travels were unnecessary. How much savings have you made from that? These issues of so-called vehicles. We're going to receive the reports very soon in Parliament. And what I'm seeing is that they are still procuring vehicles. All they say is that necessary vehicles. Who determines what? They should rather look at the size of government. When I was a minister, MPA, we had no deputy. Today there are 2 deputies. In some corporations, they have 3 deputies. Doing what? 3 deputies? Even members of parliament. I hold the view that if I had my way, you reduce the numbers in parliament. 275 for a country like Ghana. 200 people, in my opinion, can do this job. And when we talk of government size, it's not just the ministers. Those staffers and hangers-on and all that, and the president himself must demonstrate that he is prepared to cut down on expenditure with these luxurious and unnecessary private jets and all that. So clearly they should lead the way. They should reduce the level of expenditure. They should show austerity, show a level of committed, trim down the size of government. Then we can follow. But I'm clear, look, there is no, you don't need a magician. You don't even need an economist or a finance person to tell you that, look, next year things are going to get very, very, very tough. Things are going to get seriously tough for all of us. Already, salaries have been increased by just 4% in 2021. 2022 by just 7%. Meanwhile, inflation is at 34%. So if your salary was increased by 7%, but the cost of buying items, on average, is increased by 34%, you can see where you find yourself. And even with all this, we're still not making solutions. Look, we had pollution levy. We had COVID levy. We had financial sector levy. We had energy sector recovery levy. We had a e-levy. And when you look at the reports, almost all these levies, aside e-levy, have overperformed their projections. In fact, when you take the price stabilization and recovery levy, it's gone up by about 400%. COVID levy about 130%. Financial sector levy about 130%. All of them. So even the revenue side, it is the e-levy that's really impacted on the revenue side. The others are doing fantastically well. And yet, look at where we find ourselves. Look, this economy is in tatters. This economy is in a quagmire. And I think that the finance minister and the head of the economic management team, Dr. Baumia, should spare us this lengthy lecture and talks.
But there's been transparency,
they
at least at the
deal
last.
with the issue head on. And let's wait for the IMF to finish this consultation, and we'll get to know the true state of Ghana's national debt.
Well, Dr. Chimesi, as part of this debt sustainability analysis, I don't know if you also agree that debt restructuring is inevitable, but really, how do we go about that debt restructuring is the concern for many. If you were to consult with the IMF, for instance, or consult with government, what really will be the way to go for you, you would say?
Okay, so given that now Ghana is basically cut out of the international financial markets, we have to restructure. It's something that needs to be done. And when you look at the sustainability requirements for IMF program, you see that for you to be able to qualify for any fund assistance, you have to prove that you are on a path to be able to sustain your debts. And so for me, I think that it has to be done tactically. And I would side with Mr. Iwa in a sense that, yes, households are the owners of the resources in the banking sector. But we also know that there are individuals that invest directly in treasury bills through the commercial banks, right? The challenge we find now is that because of the very high interest rate in Ghana, truth be told, a lot of our commercial banks and financial institutions are also too comfortable investing in government instruments, right? So now you see that the problem has been compounded in the sense that most of these institutions are heavily invested in government instruments. Some are invested in government domestic instruments, and they are also invested in government foreign instruments in the form of Eurobonds and other financial instruments that are introduced by government on the international markets. So anything that is done that hits them, now, some of them will take the hit on the domestic markets. We know that going to restructure foreign debts have very dire consequences. So if you can do it at home, you bet charity begins at home. For me, I think that there are pensions funds, there are assets manager institutions that are also quite invested. Government can start the restructuring with those institutions in the sense that those institutions also have liquidity that is coming in consistently. So probably there will be room on their balance sheet to maneuver. The reason why I am insisting that individuals, that is the households, must be protected in terms of those that have directly bought government instruments is that if such people lose, then it means that what is all the noise we make about Ponzi schemes? What is all the noise we make about illegitimate investment instruments in the economy? If after all, you lend to the safest borrower and you end up losing. And that also has implications in terms of the savings habits and the culture that will come afterwards. So for me, I think that the negotiation should be with the institutions in terms of, for example, extension in maturity, negotiations on interest payments and those, so that people are not significantly hit in a negative way.
Well, restoring and sustaining our macroeconomic stability is key for the finance minister from what he says. But he's hoping also that by November, before he gives us our budget estimates for the year 2023, we should have reached some form of a deal with the IMF such that it will reflect in the budget. Looking at the Zambian situation, at least, we followed what happened with Zambia and how long it took. We are told we are going to be putting together a 5-member committee also as part of our debt sustainability analysis. Do you foresee that we are able to reach some form of agreement by November with the IMF such that we'll see it reflect in our budget? Dr. Chimesi, then I'll come to you, Mr. Iwa.
I think that it is looking at it from a very optimistic point of view, because I mean we are entering October with tomorrow, and indeed
we are in October actually today.
Sorry, we are in October. Okay, so indeed, the time frame is very short, but the situation we find ourselves in, looking at the challenges on the revenue mobilization side, and the fact that on the expenditure side, there is not a lot of room to maneuver in terms of debt servicing requirements and remuneration to public servants and all that. It is imperative that we get some solution in the shortest possible time. And I think that is what is informing the opportunistic view from the finance minister.
Ms. Ewa, I know you're very optimistic with building a strong financial institution. Are you that optimistic also about we reaching some form of a deal with the IMF as we look forward to that Ghana miracle by November, such that we'll see a reflection in the budget?
Yes, it's a tight one, but earlier the better. Financial markets, if there's one thing that the financial markets almost hate, is noise. And noise, expands when the space to maneuver is elongated. So as quickly as possible, if we can come to an agreement, it will be in the interest of the country. Between now and November, we only have...
Oh, no. It appears I have a cracky line there to Mr. Ewa, but I think we didn't get to tell me how hopeful you are about we reaching the deal before November. You think that is possible? You're hopeful that can happen?
Well, that depends on government's cooperation. For instance, the IMF would require a lot of information. IMF would have to do some level of validation. And then government would also have to prove that it is on the part of debt sustainability, which is to say, this is your national debt, this is how you ought to be servicing them. How are you going to service that debt?
Okay.
That is a question that the IMF would wish to seek clarification or answers from Ghana, because the books are showing now. You talked about the Zambian situation. Unfortunately for Ghana, a lot of our debt are owed to commercial entities. A lot of Zambia's debt was due to bilateral. For instance, about 1/3 of the external debt was attributable to only China. So if you can deal with China directly and China says, yes, I agree, I can push it for you. It's a sovereign nation. It has the financial muscle. So you can deal with them. But when you are dealing with commercial entities, shareholders are interested in their profit. So it's not that straightforward with the situation in Ghana. So it would depend on government's ability to prove that we are ready to make some cuts, we are ready to raise these revenues, and show realistically, bearing in mind that in the past, when we've given all this assurance to investors, Ghana has failed. Because throughout 2021, all the assurances that has been given has not materialized. But when we meet the IMF, we want to be very, very bold, very blunt, very straightforward with the IMF.
But of course, having Ghana's interest also at heart.
Exactly. Thank you very much. And it's in the spirit of national interest that will be very honest, very blunt, very sincere with the IMF when we meet them. Okay.
Dr. Chumesi, I don't know if we have Mr. Ewa back, because there's this key issue also about these Momo loans that I was hoping to pick his thoughts on. But I have you? Okay, back. Super. I have you back on this. So you were telling me about your hopes about reaching that deal in November.
Yeah, as I said, I'm quoting the managing director of IMF. She stated that a deal is possible before the end of the year. As for November, it's extremely optimistic, but we should all put our hands on deck. At the end of the day, it depends on how many areas of contentious points do we have to negotiate. If we are able to narrow down to as few as possible, then a deal is possible within the shortest possible time. Okay. So it all depends on what gets or is going to be discussed at the table. And I'm quite sure if we don't go with a lot of conditionalities on what IMF can touch and not touch, and we go saying that we are ready and willing, if it is about expenditure cuts, It's about programs that we have to stop pursuing, revenues that we have to remove from that source. It's about debt operations that we have to handle in this way or that way. If we can come to consensus within the shortest possible time, yes, then the deal is possible before the budget is read in November. But I must say that it is extremely tight.
Okay. I'll come to Dr. Chumesi, but let me wrap up with you, Ms. Ewa. We know that this week, as part of the SIM registration, I should say last week, as part of the SIM registration, we're told by the Bank of Ghana, there was a communication that came from the Bank of Ghana that those who've taken Momo loans and are abandoning their SIM cards, hopefully they will not be tracked. But we were told by the Bank of Ghana that they are on the heels of these persons. Really, is there a role that the Bankers Association are playing in all this for us to be those who have taken Momo loans and are hoping to abandon their SIM cards and not be found? Really, what's the situation?
Thank you very much. The directive from the central bank or the notice is a step in the right direction. We commend the regulator for coming out with that directive. As a country, we should all take keen interest in improving the credit culture we have in this country. We should get to the level where if you are unable to pay your rent, you should not have access to a bank facility. And that is how it is done elsewhere, that your credit exposure should be such that, just like we are discussing for the country, individuals must also understand that they have a duty to pay back. That is your number one obligation. If you owe anybody, whatever money you get, your debt should be your number one. So to the extent that one day I was out of the house and people at home called me, the lights have gone out because the credit is finished. I said, let me send you something on your mobile. And they said, oh, don't send to this number. Please, I'm going to give you a different number so you send to the boy in the house. And clearly, he had borrowed on that, and he feared that if I transferred to that account, it would be consumed by the debt on that. So who should pay? Who should pay for that debt? We should have that responsibility as a people, that the culture we create is what creates the space for more credit creation. If people take the loans and they don't pay back, who will bring the funds to give the next loan? So we commend the central bank for bringing this. As an industry, we also have a payment platform. We have the Ghana Pay, and we do not want a situation where people take facilities of Ghana Pay and decide that we are going to change our SIM and we will not have to pay back that debt. We all, from the security man or the professor, we must know that we have a duty to perform on our facilities. Just like as a country we are struggling, we should not let it translate into individuals and households also behaving in the manner as though we take facilities and we don't want to pay back. Okay. And that is why, as an industry, we also support this SIM card registration. If we get to the level where we can pin people to this ID, and if you borrow on, say, Ghana Pay, and you dish your SIM card and you go for Vodafone, and it's the same ID, Vodafone would know that you are defaulted elsewhere, and therefore you're not a credible customer. We will not give you the facility. Okay. We have to get to that, and that is where I think the Ghana card registration will take us to.
Okay, well, so we know, just in wrapping up the discussion about the IMF talks, we are entering the next lap, which is the next 5 days with the IMF team, World Bank team. So 7 pillars that were put out: debt sustainability analysis, the fiscal consolidation, strengthening our monetary and exchange rate policy. We know we are building strong financial institution, microcritical structural reforms, also maintaining peace and security, and economic growth. I'll give the final words to Dr. Chumesi. So these are the strong pillars, the pillars that the finance minister put out that we are dealing with. Your final thoughts, and then we can wrap up on the IMF talks, then we can get into the next discussion on Newsfile. Dr. Chumesi, for obvious reasons, I give you the final words.
Thank you, Emefa. I think that's when you look at all the 7 itemized indicators, you see that they are rightfully interlinked. debt sustainability is critical for macroeconomic stability, and that means that we need to consolidate the fiscal space. Indeed, I must say that we are in this critical times because over the period, when you observe the pattern of monetary policy and fiscal policy, you don't seem to, or the market doesn't seem to appreciate that a lot is being done on the fiscal side. So monetary policy consistently has been tightening the space because of the fact that inflation is increasing. But when you look at the fiscal side, you cannot really pinpoint innovations, initiatives that government is taking to be able to cut down on expenditure. So fiscal consolidation is critical in this discussion. And then when you look at in terms of other indicators such as strengthening the monetary and exchange rate regime, when the indicators are right, inflation is controlled, we will see that there would be the city will gain some momentum in terms of its rate against other initiatives. So for me, going into this agreement, I also think that you see that Ghana always, all the time, performs under an IMF program. So, but the challenge is the moment we exit the program, then the cracks begin to emerge. And you find that the foundation of that is that we do not work at the structural challenges that need to put the economy on a sustainable growth path. Okay. So going into this, hopefully, I hope that we will learn lessons and then get to work to make sure that the structure of the economy changes. And probably in another 4 years, 5 years, we don't come to sit here discussing about another IMF deal.
We're grateful.
But I beg. I know you're winding up. These 7 pillars that you've mentioned, haven't you heard them before? These 7. What's new here? What you tell me? Just if Dr. can answer, these 7 pillars that we are now being told will resolve our challenges. Have we not?
That's what we are working towards.
So what is new with these 7 pillars? That's what we want to hear.
Must it be new? Must it be new? Must it be new?
Then it's the same old thing. Okay. So we must know these 7 pillars. When you say this, what does that mean? What are you going to do? What anchors that 7 pillar? If you just come and put out your 7 pillars, anyway, you want to wind up. So
I'll take a quick break here on Newsfile, and we've been talking with Dr. Priscilla Chumesi-Bafo, she's at the Department of Economics, University of Ghana, also the President of the Bankers Association of Ghana, Mr. John Ewuah, and in the studios, Mr. John Jinapo is the ranking member on the Mines and Energy Committee. He will stay with me and keep me company in the studios, and we'll get into our next discussion on the GNPC GENSA deal. It appears there's more also that he's been talking about, 1.5 billion. That's what it looks like. There's some financial loss to the state has been caused. We've been hearing from government on this, maintaining that the CSOs, that's ASEP, Imani, they first mentioned this. They could be misleading us, but we have all the details right here on Newsfile. Please, we'll take a quick break. Stay with us.